Imani Carter had exactly 4 minutes to finish the East Wing before Takashi Ishikawa returned from his morning meeting, and she was down to 90 seconds when she heard the study door open behind her. She did not turn around right away. 22 years old and 6 months into this job, she had learned that turning around too fast made men like him think you were afraid, and fear invited questions she could not afford to answer. She finished folding the corner of the blanket on the reading chair, set the duster down without a sound, and only then looked up. Takashi stood in the doorway in a charcoal suit that had never once, in her memory, shown a single wrinkle. He was not a large man, not in the way she had expected mafia bosses to be large before she started working in this house. He was lean, precise, the kind of still that made a room feel colder. His eyes were dark enough to look black in low light, and this morning the light was low. "You're in here again," he said. "Not a question. Finishing the shelves, sir." She kept her voice even. "I'll be out in a moment." He did not move from the doorway. His gaze went past her, to the mahogany cabinet against the far wall, where a small wooden box sat under glass like something in a museum that nobody wanted to visit. It was no bigger than a hardcover book, dark lacquered wood with brass fittings gone dull with age, and a seam running around it, so fine it looked painted on rather than cut. "You've been looking at that box," he said. Imani's hands stilled on the duster. She had been looking at it every day for 6 months, dusting around the glass case because nobody had ever told her not to, and every day some part of her brain that liked puzzles more than it liked staying quiet had turned the thing over and over without ever touching it. "It's beautiful work," she said carefully. "That's all. 40 men have tried to open it." His voice did not rise, but something in it sharpened. Watchmakers. Locksmiths. A man from Kyoto, who claimed his family built puzzle boxes for 3 centuries. All of them failed. My father made sure of that before he died. He built it, so that failure was the only reasonable outcome. Then why keep trying? He looked at her then, really looked, in a way that made her feel like the duster in her hand had suddenly become the least interesting object in the room. Because there is $10 million in a number to count, and the number is inside that box. And because a man does not get to leave his son a locked door without the son wondering what is behind it. Imani said nothing. It was not her business, and she had promised herself the day she took this job that she would keep her head down, collect her pay, and never once let this house's darkness become her problem. The Ishikawa name meant something in Tokyo that made cab drivers go quiet when she gave the address. She had seen the ink at his collar once, just barely, when his shirt shifted at dinner service, and she had not needed anyone to explain to her what that meant. "You may go," he said finally, already turning back toward the hallway. Then, without looking at her again, "Leave the box where it is. Everyone does, eventually." She did not tell him that she had already started, 3 months ago, quietly counting the clicks the lid made when the light hit it a certain way. She did not tell him anything at all. She simply nodded, gathered her cart, and left the study before the silence could ask her any more questions than it already had. That night, lying in the narrow staff quarters above the garage, Imani found herself thinking about the box the way she used to think about the locks on her grandmother's old jewelry cabinet back in Atlanta, not because anyone asked her to, but because some part of her mind refused to let a solved thing stay unsolved. She told herself it was curiosity and nothing more. She was, by then, already lying to herself, though she would not understand how much until later. 3 days later, the house filled with men Imani had never seen before, each one carrying a case of tools like a surgeon arriving for an operation nobody wanted to survive. Takashi had announced it at last, $10 million, open invitation, 1 week, to anyone in Japan who believed they could open what his father had sealed. The study, usually locked to everyone but the family, became a stage. Imani was told to serve tea and stay silent, which she was very good at doing. The first man to try was an old locksmith from Osaka with hands so steady they did not shake even when Takashi stood directly behind him, arms crossed, watching. The locksmith worked for 2 hours with picks so fine Imani could barely see them glint. In the end he set his tools down, bowed low, and said only, "This was not built to be picked. It was built to be understood." Takashi's jaw tightened at that, the only movement he allowed himself, and the locksmith was paid for his time and shown out. The second man was younger, more confident, and brought a small drill he swore would not damage the box. Takashi stopped him before the bit touched the wood. "If you scratch it," he said, in the same quiet voice he used for everything, "I will make sure you never work in this city again." The man packed his case and left without trying. By the fourth day, 6 more had come and failed, and the tension in the house had thickened into something Imani could feel on her skin when she walked past the study. She kept her distance. She told herself, again, that this was not her problem. It was on the 5th day, carrying a tray of tea she had not been asked to bring, that she found herself standing in the study doorway while Takashi sat alone at his desk, the box in front of him, his hand resting flat beside it like he was afraid to touch something that had already refused him so many times. "You don't have to serve me," he said without looking up. "I didn't call for tea." "I know." She set the tray down anyway. "You've been in here since 6 this morning, sir." He looked at her then, and something in his expression was different from the cold precision she was used to, something almost raw, almost tired, in a way she suspected very few people in his life were ever allowed to see. "My father built this the year before he died. He knew I would open it eventually or spend my life trying. He wanted to know which kind of son I was." What kind of father does that? The kind who lost someone he cannot protect and decided the only lesson worth teaching was that some doors do not open for people who deserve them to. Imani did not ask who he meant. She did not need to. There was a particular hollowness in the way he said someone I could not protect that told her this was not about the box at all, not really, and some part of her, the part that had promised to keep her head down, understood that she had just been led a few inches closer to something dangerous. "May I look at it?" she asked. "Just look." He hesitated. Then, for reasons she suspected he could not have explained even to himself, he nodded. Imani crossed the room and knelt beside the desk, close enough now that she could smell the faint note of cedar and something like smoke that always seemed to follow him through the house. She did not touch the box. She only looked, turning her head slightly, watching the way the light caught the seam running around its middle. "The other men were listening for clicks," she said slowly. "Feeling for weight shifts, looking for a hidden panel. And you're not." "I'm looking at the dust." He frowned, the first genuine confusion she had seen cross his face in 6 months. "The dust." "I clean this case every day. There's a pattern in how the dust settles on the lid, a faint line, right along one edge, thinner than the rest, like something under the surface is warmer there than everywhere else. Wood doesn't hold dust evenly if there's a mechanism running just beneath it." Takashi looked at the box, then back at her, and for the first time since she had started working in his house, he looked at her the way a man looks at someone he has badly underestimated. 40 men, he said quietly, and none of them dusted it every day. 40 men were looking for a way in, Imani said. "I was just cleaning it." He did not answer right away. The silence between them was not the cold, waiting silence she was used to in this house. It was something else, something that made her very aware of how close she was kneeling to him, of the exact number of inches between her shoulder and his arm resting on the desk. She told herself it did not mean anything. She was already starting to suspect it did. The next morning, Takashi called her into the study before her shift officially began, which had never happened before, and told her, not asked her, told her, to bring the box to the long table by the window. Imani did as she was told, carrying it with both hands the way she imagined a bomb disposal technician might carry something that could still, theoretically, kill her. "You said the dust settled thinner along one edge," he said. "Show me." She set the box down and pointed to the faint line she had noticed 100 times without understanding what it meant. "Right here. If there's a mechanism underneath, it would generate the smallest amount of heat when the sun hits the lacquer, which changes how dust adheres. It's not much, but it's consistent every single day, in the same place." Takashi crouched beside the table, his eyes tracing the line she indicated, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. Then he asked, "What would you do next? If it were yours to solve?" Imani hesitated. This was the part where she was supposed to say, "That's not my place, sir. Collect her tray, and leave the men with their tools and their $10 million to sort out on their own." Instead, she heard herself say, "I'd press along that line. Not hard. Steady. See if anything gives. Do it." "Sir, I'm not one of the specialists you hired." "I hired 40 specialists," he said, "and every one of them looked at this box like a lock. You looked at it like a woman who has spent 6 months noticing things nobody asked her to notice. Do it." She did not know, later, why her hands did not shake. Perhaps it was because some part of her had been waiting for this exact permission since the first week she started working in this house, the itch to solve something finally being allowed to move past the part of her brain that kept it silent. She pressed 2 fingers along the thin line in the lacquer, slow and even, applying pressure the way she imagined pressing a bruise to see how deep it went. Nothing happened for 3 full seconds. Then something clicked, not loud, barely audible, a sound like a tooth settling into a gear it had been waiting decades to find, and a hairline seam appeared along the top of the box that had not been visible a moment before. Takashi went very still beside her. "Do it again," he said, and his voice had lost all of its usual cold precision. Imani pressed again, this time along the new seam, and the top panel of the box shifted a fraction of an inch, sliding sideways with a sound like silk dragging over silk. Beneath it was not a second panel, as she had expected, but a shallow compartment lined in faded red velvet, and inside that compartment sat a single brass key no longer than her thumb. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. 40 men, Takashi said finally, staring at the key like it might vanish if he blinked, spent a week each trying to force this box to give up its secret. "You spent 6 months simply paying attention to it." "I wasn't trying to solve anything," Imani said quietly. "I was just doing my job."
"No."
He looked up at her, and there was something in his expression she had never seen there before, not the cold command she was used to, not even the guarded curiosity from the day before, but something closer to disbelief laced with an emotion he did not seem to know what to do with. "You are the only person in this house who ever looked at that box like it deserved to be understood instead of beaten. My father would have liked you." Imani did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and the silence that settled between them was heavier than any that had come before it, not because it was empty, but because for the first time since she had started working in this house, it felt like it belonged to both of them. Takashi held the brass key like it weighed more than the box it had come from, turning it slowly between his fingers under the window light. "There's a safe deposit box registered to my father's name at a private vault in Ginza," he said, more to himself than to her. "This key opens it. I've known that much for years. I never had the key."
"Then it's done," Imani said.
"You solved it. You solved it." He said it flatly, without argument, the way a man states a fact he has already accepted and is simply waiting for the world to catch up to. $10 million was promised to whoever opened this box. That was you. Imani felt something cold move through her chest, a warning she recognized from every job she had ever worked where money changed the way people looked at her. "I don't want the money." His eyes lifted to hers, sharp again, though not unkind. "Everyone wants the money. I wanted to know how it worked," she said. "That's different." He studied her for a long moment, the kind of study that made her aware of her own pulse, and then he set the key down on the velvet lining with a care that surprised her. "My father spent the last year of his life building something designed to punish anyone who came looking for an easy answer. He wanted to know, before he died, whether I would inherit patience or only entitlement. You just proved something to me that 40 men and 6 months of watching me could not." "What's that?" "That the smartest person in this house was never one of the men I paid to be clever." He said it simply, without flattery in his voice, which somehow made it land harder than if he had dressed it up. "I've spent 6 months walking past you like you were furniture, Imani Carter. That was, I think, the first real mistake I've made in a long time." Hearing her own name in his mouth did something to her she was not prepared for. He had never said it before, not once in 6 months, not even when giving her instructions. Always you or nothing at all, and the way he said it now, slow and deliberate, made it sound like a name he intended to remember. "You know my name," she said, before she could stop herself. "I've known it since your first week." A ghost of something crossed his face, almost a smile, gone before it could fully form. I simply never had a reason to use it. Until now. She should have left the study then. Every instinct she had built over 6 months of careful, quiet survival told her to collect the tea tray, excuse herself, and let the $10 million and the brass key and the strange, careful way he was looking at her become someone else's problem. Instead, she stayed exactly where she was, and neither of them moved to change that. Word of what had happened in the study did not stay contained for long. By the following afternoon, half the house staff knew that the maid from the East Wing had solved what 40 specialists could not, and by evening, so did the men whose reputations had been quietly destroyed by their failure. One of them, a locksmith from Kyoto named Ryuichi Sato, who had built his entire career on the claim that no puzzle box in Japan could defeat him, arrived at the estate gates that night demanding to see Takashi in person. Imani was in the kitchen when the shouting started in the front hall, and she was still drying her hands on a dish towel when one of the house guards came to find her, his face tight with something that made her stomach drop before he said a single word. "He's asking for you," the guard said. "Not Ishikawa-san."
You.
She found Ryuichi Sato standing just inside the front doors, his coat still damp from the rain, his face the particular shade of red that came from a man who had built his entire identity around being the best at something and had just discovered, publicly, that he was not. Takashi stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his expression unreadable in the way she now understood meant he was paying very close attention. "You," Sato said, jabbing a finger toward Imani the moment she entered the hall. "A maid. A servant with no training, no tools, no reputation. Humiliated men who have spent decades perfecting this craft. I want to know how." "I looked at the dust," Imani said simply. "That's all." "That's a lie." His voice rose, sharp enough that 2 of the house guards shifted their weight, watching him more carefully now. "No one solves a Ishikawa puzzle box by looking at dust. Someone told you the mechanism. Someone gave you information the rest of us were never allowed to have." "No one told me anything," Imani said, and she felt something steady settle into her voice, the same calm certainty she had felt kneeling beside that box with her fingers pressed against warm lacquer. "I clean that case every day. I noticed something the rest of you never had the patience to notice, because none of you were ever in that room long enough to see it." Sato's jaw worked, and for a moment Imani genuinely believed he might cross the space between them, and some old, careful part of her braced for it the way she had learned to brace for anger in rooms where she held no power. But before he could take a single step, Takashi moved. He did not raise his voice. He did not touch the other man. He simply stepped between them, close enough that Sato had to look up slightly to meet his eyes, and said, in a tone so quiet the whole hall seemed to lean in to hear it, "You will not speak to her again." "Ishikawa-san, I only meant—" "I know exactly what you meant." Takashi's voice did not rise, but something underneath it had gone very cold, the particular stillness Imani had learned over 6 months to recognize as the most dangerous version of him. "You came into my home to accuse a woman in my employ of lying, because your pride cannot survive the truth that she succeeded where you failed. That ends now. You will leave, and you will not return to this estate." Sato looked between the 2 of them, something shifting behind his eyes as he seemed to understand, all at once, exactly what he was witnessing. Not simply a boss defending an employee, but something else entirely, something none of them had a name for yet. He said nothing further. He gathered his coat, bowed stiffly, and left through the front doors without another word, and the guards closed them behind him with a heavy, final sound. Takashi did not turn to her right away. He stood facing the closed doors for a long moment, his shoulders set in a way that told her the conversation had cost him something he was not used to spending. When he finally turned around, his eyes found hers immediately, as if he had known exactly where she was standing the entire time without needing to check. "Thank you," Imani said quietly, "for that. I didn't do it for gratitude." He crossed the hall toward her, slower than she expected, and stopped closer than he usually allowed himself to stand. "I did it because no one in this house is permitted to make you feel small for being right." The words settled into her chest with a weight she was not prepared for. She had spent 6 months building careful distance between herself and every person in this house, telling herself that survival meant staying invisible, useful, unremarkable. Somewhere in the last 2 days, without her permission, that distance had started to collapse. "You should go rest," he said, though his eyes did not move from her face. "It's been a long day for both of us." "Is that an order?" Something flickered at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but close enough that she felt it land somewhere beneath her ribs. "Call it a request. I don't make many of those." She left the hall that night more shaken than she wanted to admit, not by Sato's anger, but by the particular way Takashi had stood between her and it, like a wall built specifically to her measurements. She told herself it meant nothing beyond an employer protecting his staff. She was already starting to suspect that was not entirely true, and the suspicion followed her all the way up the stairs to her small room above the garage, refusing to let her sleep until well past midnight. The trouble did not end with Sato's departure. 3 nights later, Imani woke to the sound of raised voices somewhere below her window, and by the time she had pulled on her robe and made it down the back stairs, the kitchen was full of house guards moving with the particular urgency she had learned, over 6 months, meant something had gone badly wrong. Someone tried to get into the study, one of the guards told her, when she asked. "The security feed shows a man in the garden an hour ago. Gone before we could reach him. He didn't get inside, but he was looking for something." Imani's stomach dropped. The box is fine. Ishiko-san moved it to the vault himself the morning after you opened it." The guard's eyes flicked toward the hallway leading to the private wing. "He's asking for everyone to stay inside tonight. No exceptions." She found Takashi in his study an hour later, standing at the window with the lights off, watching the dark garden below like he expected the shadows themselves to answer for what had happened. He did not turn when she entered, though she was fairly certain he had heard her the moment her hand touched the door. "You should be asleep," he said. "So should you." A short, humorless breath left him, almost a laugh. Sato has connections beyond a wounded ego. If he decided tonight that humiliation deserved retaliation, he would not have come alone, and he would not have come quietly. Whoever was in that garden was testing how far our security reaches. That's worse than an attack. That's a rehearsal. Imani crossed the room to stand beside him, close enough now that the space between them had stopped feeling like the careful distance of employer and employee weeks ago. "Do you think it was him?" "I think," Takashi said slowly, "that $10 million and a public humiliation are a very effective way of making enemies out of men who were already dangerous before you solved my father's box." He turned to look at her then, and in the dim light his expression had lost every trace of the cold composure she had first met 6 months ago. "I put you in danger the moment I let the entire house learn your name. You didn't put me anywhere. I chose to help you. And I let you because watching you solve something 40 better trained men could not was the first thing in years that made me feel like I was still capable of being surprised." His voice had dropped, quieter now, almost rough at the edges. "That was selfish of me. I should have protected you from the attention instead of standing there and admiring it." "I'm not asking to be protected," Imani said. "I'm asking you to trust that I can handle what comes next, the same way I handled the box." He studied her for a long moment, something warring behind his eyes that she could not quite name, pride, maybe, or fear, or some tangled combination of both that a man like him had likely never been permitted to feel out loud. "There is a version of tonight," he said finally, "where I send you away from this house until the danger passes. It would be the responsible choice." "And the other version?" "The other version," he said, and his voice had gone low enough that she felt it more than heard it, "is one where I admit that the thought of you leaving this house bothers me far more than it should, for a man who has spent his entire life being careful not to want anything he cannot afford to lose." The silence that followed felt different from every silence that had come before it in this house, charged, deliberate, the kind that made the air between them feel thinner than it should. Imani did not step back. She was not entirely sure in that moment that she wanted to. "I'm not leaving," she said quietly. "Not because you're asking me to stay. Because I've decided to." Something shifted in his face. Not surprise, exactly, but something closer to relief, guarded and unfamiliar on features that had spent so long giving nothing away. He reached out, slowly, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face with a care that felt entirely at odds with everything she had heard whispered about the kind of man he was capable of being when the situation demanded it. "You are the only person who has ever solved something in this house that I could not," he murmured, "and the only person who has ever made me want to be understood in return." The garden intruder returned 2 nights later, though this time the security team was ready, and what should have been a quiet arrest turned, within seconds, into something far more dangerous. Imani heard the gunfire from her room above the garage before she heard anything else, 3 sharp cracks in quick succession, followed by shouting that carried across the grounds with a violence that made her blood run cold. She did not think. She moved. By the time she reached the main house, 2 guards lay wounded near the garden entrance, and a third man she did not recognize was sprinting toward the private wing where she knew Takashi kept a small office he used late at night, a room with only 1 door and 1 window, a room that would trap him as easily as it might have once protected him. She understood in the space of a single breath that this had never been about testing security. It had been about getting close enough to finish what Sato's pride had started. She reached the office corridor seconds after the intruder did, and what she saw stopped her heart cold. Takashi standing with his back against the wall beside the doorway, perfectly still, watching the intruder's shadow move across the frosted glass of the door with a kind of patience that told her he had already calculated 3 different ways this could end and was simply choosing which one to allow. The intruder kicked the door open. Takashi moved before the door had finished swinging, closing the distance in 2 silent steps and driving his forearm into the man's throat with a precision that spoke of a violence she had never seen him use, only sensed simmering beneath his stillness. The gun clattered from the intruder's hand, skidding across the floor toward Imani's feet, and she did not hesitate. She dropped to the ground and grabbed it before either man could reach it first. "Don't move," she said, and her voice did not shake, though every part of her body was screaming that it should. The intruder froze, Takashi's forearm still pressed hard against his windpipe, his eyes flicking toward the gun now steady in Imani's hands. Something passed between the 2 men in that moment, some silent understanding of exactly how outmatched the intruder had suddenly become, and he stopped struggling entirely. "Who sent you?" Takashi said, his voice barely above a whisper, more dangerous for its quietness than any shout could have been. The man said nothing. Takashi pressed harder, and Imani watched something in his expression she had never seen before, not the cold precision of a businessman protecting his empire, but the raw, unguarded fury of a man who had almost lost something he had only just allowed himself to want. "Takashi." Her voice cut through the tension, steady and clear. "We need him alive. He can't tell us anything dead." For a moment, she was not sure he had heard her at all. Then, slowly, the pressure of his arm eased, though his eyes never left the intruder's face. "She's right," he said finally, and something in his voice suggested the admission cost him more than the violence would have. "Take him to the basement. I want every name he has before morning." The guards arrived seconds later, dragging the intruder away, and it was only once the corridor had emptied that Takashi finally turned to look at her, the gun still steady in her hands, her chest still heaving from the run across the grounds. "You could have stayed in your room," he said quietly. "You could have died in yours," she answered, and something in the exchange made them both go very still, the adrenaline of the last 2 minutes settling into something heavier, something that felt like the exact moment a line got crossed that neither of them would be able to walk back from. He crossed the space between them and took the gun gently from her hands, setting it aside without looking away from her face. "You ran toward the danger," he said, disbelief threading through his voice. "Everyone in this house runs from it. You ran toward it." "I wasn't going to let you die over a box I helped you open," Imani said, and her voice cracked slightly on the last word, the fear she had been holding back finally catching up to her now that the danger had passed. "I couldn't." Takashi's hand came up to cradle the side of her face, and this time neither of them pretended the touch was anything but deliberate. "Say that again," he murmured. "I couldn't lose you." The words left her before she could stop them, honest in a way she had not allowed herself to be in 6 months of careful distance. "I don't know when that happened, but it happened." It happened for me the moment you looked at 40 years of my father's cruelty and decided it was a puzzle worth understanding instead of a wall worth fearing. His thumb traced her cheekbone, slow and reverent. I have spent my entire life being told that men like me do not get to keep the things we want. I am done believing that. He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the careful distance either of them had maintained for 6 months. It was certain, deliberate, the physical answer to a question neither of them had been brave enough to ask out loud until the danger had forced the truth out of both of them at once. Imani did not pull away. She had spent 6 months telling herself this was not her problem, that this house and its violence and its dangerous, magnetic owner were things to survive rather than things to want. She understood now, with his hand still cradling her face and his mouth still close enough to hers that she could feel the warmth of his breath, that she had been lying to herself the entire time. The intruder gave up 3 names before dawn, and by the time the sun rose over the estate, Takashi's men had already begun moving through the city with the quiet, methodical violence of an organization settling a debt it did not intend to let stand. Imani did not ask for details. She understood, by now, that some parts of this world were not hers to carry, and that the man she had chosen to stand beside carried enough of that weight, without her adding to it. Ryuichi Sato was found 2 days later, not dead, but thoroughly and permanently removed from any position of influence he had once held in the city's underworld, his reputation, his contracts, and his standing among the other families dismantled with a precision that told Imani everything she needed to know about what happened to men who threatened something Takashi Ishikawa had decided was his to protect. "You didn't have to destroy him," she said, when Takashi told her, watching his face carefully for whatever truth lived beneath the calm way he delivered the news. "I did," he said simply. "Not for the box. Not even for my father's memory. For you." He looked at her steadily, none of the coldness she remembered from their first months together anywhere in his expression now. "A man who sends someone to hurt what I care about does not get to keep existing in my city as though nothing happened. That is not cruelty. That is the only language men like him understand." Imani did not argue. She had spent enough time in this house now to understand that the version of safety Takashi offered was not gentle, was never going to be gentle, and that loving him, because that was what this had become, however carefully she had avoided naming it until now, meant accepting a world where danger and devotion lived in the same room, often at the same time. "What happens now?" she asked instead. "Now," Takashi said, reaching for her hand with a certainty that no longer surprised her, "I stop pretending you are staff in this house, and start treating you like what you actually are." "Which is?" He brought her hand to his lips, his eyes never leaving hers. "The only person who ever looked at me and saw something worth understanding instead of something worth fearing. My father built a box designed to punish anyone who came looking for easy answers. I think, in the end, it was never about the money inside. I think he wanted to know if his son would ever find someone patient enough to stay." Imani thought of the $10 million still sitting untouched in the account the brass key had opened, of the 40 men who had come and failed and left with nothing but bruised pride, of the 6 quiet months she had spent dusting a glass case, without ever intending to change her own life in the process. "I didn't open that box for the money," she said quietly. "And I'm not staying for it either." "I know." Takashi's hand tightened around hers, steady and certain in a way that made the whole dangerous, complicated world outside the estate walls feel, for the first time in a long while, like something she was no longer facing alone. "That is exactly why I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have a single reason to leave."